Hey there, my name's Sebastian, and this is Talk.Pod, a podcast where I have conversations with some of the most interesting podcasters in the world. My guest today is Rob Kassees, a musician and podcast host of the 1001 Album Complaints podcast. At its core, it's a music history podcast that focuses on analyzing classic albums and revealing the backstories of how they were made. If you've ever wanted to impress anyone with your depth of musical knowledge, this might be the podcast for you. I'm going to ask Rob about his podcast, how he's grown and promoted the show, what tools he's found most useful for marketing, and how he feels podcasts fit into today's society. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Sebastian.
Of course. Okay, so let's get into it. Your show is billed as classic albums, full backstories told by musicians who love to nitpick the details. And I believe you've crossed the 1 million download mark. When you first launched the show, what did you think it would be, and how different is that from sort of the reality of today?
Yeah, great question. When we started, it's a bit of two sides of a coin. On the one hand, our number one goal was to connect with old friends about the thing that we all formed our friendships around initially, which was music. We're all musicians. We all grew up together, and now we're middle-aged. We have families, we have careers, and we're spread apart geographically. So this started as a pandemic project where we just wanted to rekindle some of that friendship and also the thing that we most enjoyed talking about, which was music. But in addition to that, I did think hard about the longevity potential of the idea. And so before we recorded episode number 1, we went back and forth a little bit on our text chain about how to come up with a sustainable idea. And frankly, just it's my personality type to approach things like this and say, yeah, I know it's going to be fun, but I don't really want to put my full brain and heart into it unless I know it's going to go for like at least 100 episodes. So I did have it in my mind. And the reason I like things to go on a little longer is specifically because I wanted to have a chance to evolve it and make it better and make it good and really make it something that I could be proud of.
Yeah, so the podcast is anchored to the 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die book. How is your own experience writing and recording music sort of influenced the way you deconstruct the production and history of some of the albums that you talk about?
Yeah, of course. It's had so much impact. When I think about my journey from music listener and appreciator as a preteen even, to starting to play music, to starting to write my own songs, perform with my own bands, and then ultimately get into this whole separate discipline of recording and then releasing music. You know, at each successive phase, you're adding a new layer of how you listen to music, the original thing that you loved. And I'll admit there could be a little bit of a downside to it in the sense that it's hard for me to just turn off my brain when I'm listening to music. I am often thinking about the details that perhaps your average listener or even myself at age 12 was not thinking about. What chord is that? How does that chord progression work? What harmony is being sung there? All that kind of stuff. You know, where was the mic placed on that snare drum? It doesn't exactly take away from my enjoyment, but it is there and it adds these layers. So certainly my experience has been a huge part of that. And that said, I will happily admit that I gave up the dream of being a professional musician myself long ago and decided to have a much more practical life and career. I'm very happy with that decision. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so if at best I have been a high-level amateur who was dedicated to the craft of playing, recording, and performing music, but I do not have the experience of a true professional.
Yeah, fair enough. The title of your podcast has the word complaints sort of baked into it and kind of sets up the show. But, listening to the episodes, it's clear to me that it's made by people who, really love music. How do you think about that balance between sort of the affectionate nitpicking that you do and just being, being a critic? And is there sort of a line there that you won't cross?
Yeah, that's a great question. Keep in mind that I really see the reason we're doing the show and what's most interesting about the show is our friendship. These are a group of guys who have been friends and hanging out consistently and talking about music and playing music together consistently for 30 years in some cases. And so we have that friendship to fall back on. I think that's one of the ways we keep it really lighthearted, and our main goal is to make each other laugh and to recreate what our conversations have always been like, and I think what all bandmates and friends who love music's conversations are like, which is just to nitpick things, including the things you love. It's not really, you get to this level of music appreciation, it becomes a little less about I like this or I don't like this other thing. It becomes more about the analysis and the laughing about little goofy decisions. And so that's where this all comes from. That's the origin story, right? Is that we would have these conversations at the bar or in the van ride to the next gig after, while we're on tour, radio, any song comes on the radio and you just start talking about it. You go, oh, what about those guys in Sympathy for the Devil who just have, Keith Richards has to be back there going, woo, woo. And that lasts for like 7 minutes. That must have been hard.
That's right.
Little stuff like that. So that's the core of it. I hope it comes across that we're lovers of music. We're appreciators of music. We debated the title quite a bit. I did want to get across. I understand that it might come off as a little negative, and that could be seen as a little bit of a drawback to some people. I don't really mean it that way, but I did mean it in the sense of this kind of nitpicky, what I think all musicians, and this is what we hear from our fans, that are musicians is like, oh yeah, this is exactly how my friends and I talk about music. It's nitpicking with love and coming from a place of love and respect for the craft, but still realizing that there's always something goofy to laugh about there.
Yeah, I do think that really comes across in your show. So, and as you mentioned, you've got multiple co-hosts on the podcast, and from what I've heard, they all seem to kind of fill a bit of a different role on the show. Mm-hmm. What I'm wondering is, did that come about organically, or was it more of a deliberate, something you designed in order for the podcast to function the way it does?
More or less organically, because what you hear on the tape is my friends' actual personalities, and they play out. I think if you have listened to enough of us talk, you start to have the sense that you know us. And honestly, I think you kind of do know us. I think you have a sense of what the dynamic is, who the natural leaders of the group are, the kinds of people who are more practical versus more, let's say, wildly creative. And that's just a vestige of our actual relationships and the roles that we have tended to play in the bands we've been in and things like that. So I'd say for the most part, organically. But the group itself has always been a tight-knit group. And perhaps you could argue that all friend groups that stay together that long have a certain kind of personality balance of that sort.
True. Yeah. Now each episode at the end of it has a vote, which is essentially, should you really hear this album before you die? Have you had any sort of controversial verdicts? One that you sort of knew was going to get you a lot of feedback from listeners? Have you done any verdicts that have gotten the most sort of outrage?
Yeah, great question. So the list itself was written by a UK-based critic, and I think it's fair to say, and we comment on this on the show often, that it is fairly UK-centric in its worldview of what music is most important here. And you may be able to tell from my accent, but I and all my friends are American. We grew up in America. We have a more American-centric worldview of music, naturally, right? And so the answer to your question is going to be some of the UK stuff that we don't have any nostalgia or really context for. the one that comes to mind is the Prodigy, which is just not a band. It was very early in our episode run, so I think earlier in our show, we did a significantly poorer job of balancing criticism and jokes with storytelling and getting inside the mind of the artist. So take that with a grain of salt. That's something that we've really worked hard to evolve and give a little more of a balanced take, or at least to have some sympathy for where the artist is coming from, right? Which I think helps with appreciation. So the Prodigy is one that comes up a lot as something that UK listeners will just say, you Yanks do not understand. And I guess they're right. I haven't revisited it since we talked about it, but it'll be things of that ilk. That said, I think in general, the verdict of the show, I think most of our listeners would tend to agree that we get it right. I don't think there's a ton of controversy in the votes themselves. What I do end up hearing, and what I find somewhat ironic, it's the nature of the format of the show and the fact that we goof on things. I hear people, I think, wrongly commenting on our episodes that we don't like something that I know that I actually do like and attempted to express my appreciation for. So it's a little, if we get that kind of feedback, it tends to be a little more about the errant comments that we make during the show, not properly appreciating Oasis or somebody like that, even though we agreed that listening to them, they're an important band and they should be listened to, that sort of thing.
Now, the albums in the book, from what I understand, when you're picking them, you're sort of picking them randomly, which means that sometimes you'll land which probably means that sometimes you land on something you love and sometimes on something you don't love so much.
Sure does.
What do you find has sort of produced a better episode? The ones that you're, head over heels over, or, covering an album that, you can't really jive with?
Great question. I don't think there's an easy answer to it, because I think the variety is what I personally appreciate as a listener. And that is why randomness, if you will, was always built in to the concept of the show. We wanted to bounce between those things. I will tell you, though, that we have somewhat purposefully avoided obviously great records that we all agree are great. And we tend to save those for our milestone episodes. I think that is fun. I mean, I certainly enjoy listening, and I certainly enjoy taping those episodes and talking about Ziggy Stardust or Pink Floyd's The Wall or something, or Abbey Road. But nothing there is super surprising. And, they're fun to dive into. I always learn something. So they're sort of fun on that level. On the other hand, stuff that, if I had to pick my favorite type of episode, and after I describe it to you, you're going to understand why it's very difficult to manufacture this. It is the episode where I have either low or no expectations about something, and it completely blows me away, and I love it.
That's interesting.
And when that's the energy in the room, that is really exciting. And I will tell you, it's a little bit rare, both because I've heard a lot of stuff in my life, and stuff doesn't always age well. But when that happens and there's some level of agreement about that topic, those are really exciting. It feels like we're discovering things together again, like we did when we were teenagers. That's great.
So, given what you just said there, would you say there's maybe like one or two non-obvious album episodes that you wish every new listener to the show would start with, that sort of captures most accurately what the show is all about?
Yeah, absolutely. Two jump to mind, but let me just start by saying I think starting not at the beginning is a better bet, because the show did evolve. We became more consistent about our formatting. We got better at storytelling, all these kinds of things. So in my mind, those very early episodes they have value, but they're only interesting to me after you have gotten to know us a little bit. And the other thing that I've noticed is that people will tend to look for their personal favorite album as a first pick, which is not always a great choice, because they might easily be turned off by us goofing on it, which we do at the beginning of every episode. But to answer your question, two episodes come to mind that represent two different archetypes. One is The Doors' self-titled debut. And that represents the archetype of what I just told you my favorite was, which was we had all heard The Doors before. Who hasn't heard The Doors, of course? And in my mind going in, I was kind of over it. I thought of them as a gateway band that you moved beyond. But as I dove into both the story and the record, and my friends felt the same, we were blown away by how impressive it was. And I think you can hear and feel that energy in the room. And we talk about why it's much better than we thought it was going to be. And I just thought that was a really great episode with amazing energy, a really fun, cool, interesting backstory, lots of laughs, but also this element of discovery. The other one that jumps out to me, and it's a general comment, but I'll give a specific recommendation. The specific recommendation is Digital Underground Sex Packets. Because when you look at this 1001 albums you must hear before you die list, I don't care who you are, you're going to find some stuff on that list. You're going to be like, why is this on here? Like, I don't even know what this is, but I kind of have a sense that it doesn't belong, that I'm not going to like it, whatever it might be. And I felt that way about Digital Underground, both before and after the episode. However, I think it was an extremely funny episode, and I think that new listeners would do well to, like we end an episode like that, and I find myself sometimes on the show saying, you were better off listening to our episode, which gave clips of the songs, than actually wasting your time listening to the record itself, because we told an interesting story. We made we had a lot of laughs. We made a lot of good jokes about it. And we also gave you an idea of what is in there and what the argument might be for it being important as well, even if we ultimately didn't think it was. So to me, that was just a very funny episode, made me laugh a lot, but it's the kind of one that it's almost no one's favorite album, so it's not going to be a top pick for people.
Okay, so I'll make sure that those recommendations you just mentioned are in the show notes for this episode. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what you've done to promote the podcast. So I came across a quote from you. I can't remember if it was in a print magazine, but you said that there's a lot of people who are either barely trying or just not very good at podcasting, and that
sure,
you don't have a lot of respect for anyone who thinks just popping a mic in front of two people is enough, which of course I agree with as well. I'm curious what you think separates sort of podcasts that survive from the ones that don't.
There are a couple things. The biggest one is a seemingly simple, but deceptively hard, which is consistency. You need to prepare for the fact that you're going to have to do this consistently, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And if that could mean designing your show to have built-in topics like we did. We knew when we started the show that we had 1,001 weeks minimum of content ready to go. We didn't have to think too hard about what the topic of the next week was, Things like that can be really helpful, and understanding that it is a long process. The second piece is what I mentioned close to the top of the episode, which is willingness to change and evolve. So in my day job, I work in software. And what I've learned working in software in Silicon Valley is iteration is everything.
Mm-hmm.
Get the minimum viable product out the door, see how it lands, listen to it yourself, and start the process of making it better. And that is likely to be a long road. And some of that process, and we could even call it product development if we're being highfalutin about it, means building in repeatable segments and having things that listeners can hang their hat on that make them want to tune in week over week. That's not necessarily just based on the topic itself, which in turn, by the way, helps you make the show every week. It makes it a little easier for you, like as you lock into a format. So I think those are two really big ones. If you can do both of those things, in other words, if you can go for an extended period of time and you can get better through trial and error or evolve in some way, you're likely to come at the end of that or at some point with a great product, a great show.
Looking back over the whole arc of your show, you mentioned that it was sort of a product of the pandemic. Are there any sort of turning points or kind of inflection points that that really moved the needle for you in terms of the audience that you started to grow?
Yeah, great question. So I alluded to it, but the first turning point was when we decided it was good enough to tell anyone about, which took a little while. I knew that what we were doing wasn't that special, and I wanted time to develop it in some of the ways I suggested. And so I didn't do any marketing or really social media for almost a year while I felt like we were figuring out what the show could be. So that as soon as I started promoting it in any way, shape, or form, of course, that made it, we got an inflection point there in terms of the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
The other one that jumps to mind was, and it took me a little while to realize this, but about 2 years ago, we really started leaning into the community angle on Patreon.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people think of Patreon as a site where creators and creatives can basically launch a subscription service and get paid for their work. And it is that. And it's great for that, right? And I recommend people support creators and people who make things generally. But we've also been able to use it just to build a free, completely free community there where we like to say, continue the conversation. People listen to us, friends talking about music, and in their heads, they're either yelling at their speakers or they're wanting to contribute. Giving them a venue to contribute via a community comment thread on every single episode, I think has been really great in cultivating this community. And so I guess the realization there to get to that point was people would be writing into us and telling us, hey, this reminds me of me and my friends, or I wish I had friends like this, or I used to have friends like this, or, it's so cool to hear you guys talk, and here's this other thing that you missed, or this other factoid, or this other personal experience I had. So now the strategy, if it is a strategy, is just to lean into that, because I think that's really cool that people want to contribute. I always learn from our commenters and our people who email in. They always give us really cool tidbits. And someone wrote in with the best extra anecdote the other day, which was about Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers recording hand claps for the original Linn Drum, just randomly, for one of the first and most influential drum machines ever, happens to have Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, the band, hand clapping on it, which in turn means that hand clap then made its way into so many recordings throughout the 80s and 90s, and like Prince, it's on When Doves Cry, for instance. And so effectively, Tom Petty's hand claps are on all these recordings. Anyway, it was just a cool anecdote. We didn't catch it in our history of Tom Petty. So the answer is, as soon as we realized that what we actually were building was a community, that really helped us speed the process to get to enlarge that community and bring more people in.
Yeah, it sounds like communities played a really big role for you. I've noticed also your episode titles, almost all of them have, famous artists' name in them, obviously. So I'm wondering how you think about that and how much of your audience acquisition you think you can attribute to, that sort of natural search traffic of people looking up, Billy Joel or Public Enemy or the Beatles or, insert famous musical act name here.
Yep. It's an excellent question and something I care a lot about. And I'll admit that at the start, I wasn't really thinking that would be such a helpful thing for us. And in fact, if used incorrectly, it could be a harmful thing, because searchability is great if that person is actually trying to listen to the backstory of Abbey Road, not Abbey Road itself.
Right.
And so there is potential for confusion there as well. So the short answer is yes, that is helping us. And I have dove into the analytics and attempted to experiment with how those titles should be to find a balance between this, yes, this does come up, but only when you are actually looking for the thing that we are serving and making it clear what that thing is.
And I think that's a really particularly salient point too, when you think about apps like Spotify that mix that content together, right? You perform a search in Spotify, and not only do you have, music tracks and albums coming up, but you've got podcasts as well, right? Now, The way they display those search results certainly is categorized in some way. But, the average person could very easily click into a podcast thinking, this is the track I'm trying to listen to, or the album, or the artist. Yeah.
And I'm sure that does happen all the time. And if I was to give advice to folks out there trying to grow their podcast, pay attention to this. Because what I realized, I did think about this, and I am kind of a numbers-driven person. And when I looked at our analytics relatively early on, as soon as we started getting a few real listeners, I said, well, what platform are they listening on? Well, and Spotify was the dominant platform, even though I, at that time, was not personally listening to podcasts on Spotify, because that's still a relatively new thing. I listen to music on Spotify, right? And I was like, okay, well, that makes sense because we're a music-based podcast. Great. I'm going to lean into that. And the other reason that it's worth leaning into is because, as you mentioned, Spotify, for all their ills, and I have complaints about them as well, but they have invested a lot of energy and time into discoverability.
Mm-hmm.
And the other platform that's done that is YouTube, I would say. Those are really the two that have done it well, and you can users can count on that you're going to get recommendations, right? And recommendations are really just free advertising. So dive into what that looks like for your show and how you can make that work for you. And in that sense, pledge allegiance. I didn't literally pledge allegiance, but decide on a platform and try to optimize for that. Make it your life a little bit easier, even though 30% of people still listen to our show through Apple Podcasts, which is great, more power to them. But Apple Podcasts doesn't really have that same level of analytics in the back end for me to look at and understand. B, they don't really do the recommendation thing nearly as much or as well as Spotify or YouTube. So I tend to focus my attention on those platforms where I can get something back out of it.
That makes sense. I know you've also done some guest appearances on other podcasts, and I'm wondering what you've learned from being a guest that sort of actually winds up converting new listeners back to your own show.
Great question. I will tell you this. A lot of the advice you will find out there about promoting your show is to go on other shows. Makes sense. Some captive audience already interested in podcasts. They hear your voice. They're going to go somewhere else. They're going to hear your voice. That said, the analytics trails aren't that amazing for really understanding how that has affected our listenership. But I want to tell you that I don't really overthink it, other than to come prepared and to be myself and to sound intelligent as best I can about the thing that our show does, which is music and podcasting. So yeah, I think there's only so much you can do, but to be a good guest, I think you have to bring energy, you have to bring some level of preparation, and maybe this isn't maybe it's obvious, maybe it's overlooked, but you have to work on your ability to talk and broadcast and public speak. And little things can really hamstring your ability to sound confident and sound intelligent and sound insightful, including filler words and qualifying words and all kinds of little things. And that's part of what I've worked on and my team has worked on as we've done the show, but it's also a very helpful skill in regular life too, if you want to communicate more clearly.
I am learning all of this as a first-time podcaster. The first time I went to edit my first podcast, I could not believe the amount of verbal tics that I have and that anybody has, trying to fill in the spaces of silence with ums and ahs and all kinds of other, verbal sort of filler words. But another question I had for you was, I noticed that with each episode, you release a companion Spotify playlist. Mm-hmm. And you include all the songs that are referenced throughout that episode, which, by the way, I think is a really unique marketing tactic. I've not seen other podcasters do anything similar. But my question is, how do you think that kind of, ancillary content extends the life of your episodes and has the potential to pull in new listeners?
It's a great question. And I'll be honest, I haven't thought too hard about that decision in a while. But I have to imagine my original thinking, right, was, of course, we're talking about music. We're talking about a specific album. And let's say the underlying premise of the show is that you've heard the album we're talking about at least once. You don't have to, as we always say at the top of the show, because we're going to play clips. But then in the midst of that, we'll reference all these other things. Well, this song sounds like this song, and this song is, oh, that reminds me of this. And, little jokes and asides that reference the musical canon. To me, I'm just trying to think of myself as a listener. To me, a lot of times I would want to pause and go, what are they talking about there? Or is that a reference to this? And I would want to go look at that. And I think it would draw me in more to the group. Here's another observation about podcasts and the parasocial relationship that we as listeners feel with podcasters, and specifically podcasts where the people talking have this really great relationship, which I've always found fascinating, right? I almost like it better when I'm listening to a podcast where you can tell there's a deep, long-lasting relationship underneath the conversation that you're not necessarily quite a part of.
Mm.
But as a host, a lot of times, and this is something I've had to learn, you have to open up and bring the audience in. Somebody makes a comment, I know what they're talking about. It's a reference to something I know very, very well, but I have to check myself and think of the audience and go, let's explain what 5/4 time is to the audience. Let's explain what a tritone substitution is to the audience, what spring reverb is, whatever it might be, or some other part of our past we might be referencing. Because, of course, friends are going to use shorthand. So I see it as under that heading very generally, which is we often quickly reference songs, material from the musical canon that we internally know what we're talking about. We want to make sure the listener has a chance to know what the heck we're talking about too. And I think that makes them feel like they're more part of the group.
Now, you're also dealing with a lot of albums that people already have strong feelings about. And
Sure.
So what I'm curious about is, have you used that sort of built-in, nostalgia in disagreement in some of your marketing and how you present the show? Are there deliberate ways in which you kind of lean into the whole argue with us about this album or this particular piece of music about that as a growth tool?
Yeah, absolutely. So the main comment thread that we post simultaneous with the episode every week on that very free, completely free Patreon page, at its core, it's a poll that says, should this album be on the 1001 albums list that you must hear before you die or not? And now argue about it effectively. And the idea is that they've heard our verdict and our opinions, but honestly, maybe they haven't yet. Some people weigh in before they listen to our show, and that's great. So yes, I would say the whole show and its format and its name is a little bit, I'll call it light rage baiting, right? That like we're trying to get you to disagree with us a little bit. And the other thing we do that could be seen as a pro or a con, depending on how you're looking at it, I can certainly see both sides, is that right at the top of the show, well, one, we give a disclaimer that we're musicians and we're going to goof on things like musicians do, even though we have love and respect for anyone who tries anything, frankly, because I really do. Whether I like it or not is irrelevant, right? You made something. It was hard. I understand. But then we do a snarky tweet-length review. That's one of the segments we do on the show. It's just a way to write a joke to make each other laugh. We go extra mean on it. Yeah, I'll be honest, that pisses some people off and makes them turn off the show.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's pretty much right at the top before we tell the backstory or give our more nuanced opinions or anything like that. So some of that is purposeful because I think it's realistic to how I talk to my friends and how other musicians that I've hung around with over my life, hundreds and hundreds of them in other bands and things like that. That's how they talk. That's just how we talk. We joke about things. I think, one of my heroes is David Bowie. I can still make fun of David Bowie. It's not hard, actually. So maybe I'm going off on a little tangent here, but I think one of the things the show is attempting to puncture, or an underlying worldview of the show that I have, is stop taking yourself so seriously. I don't care for self-seriousness in art. Generally, I think everything is make fun of a bull, even really, really amazing stuff. like the Beatles or Pink Floyd or, take your pick. And ultimately art is subjective anyway. So yes, as best as I can, I don't want to make people viscerally angry at me. Of course, I'm a pretty nice guy. And honestly, I think if anything, doing the show these 5 years has softened me up to hearing new music and has made me more sympathetic to a wider variety of music. Especially you hear these backstories and you understand better where these people were coming from and what they were trying to achieve, and whether they achieved it or not is subjective. But, it's softened me up over time to a certain extent. But yeah, of course, if complaints is in the name, if we're coming to make fun of your favorite artist, you're going to have a reaction. And that was baked into the concept.
Now, given the sort of history of music criticism and the sort of modern nature of our online lives where, a lot of attention has been sort of stolen by the short form platforms, TikTok and Instagram and, YouTube Shorts. And we're sort of living through this culture of very short attention spans. What I'm curious there is how you feel about that and how it sort of contrasts with the long form format of podcasts, and how do you feel sort of musical criticism and is sort of consumed these days by modern audiences?
Yeah, it's a big question, right? I will say that when podcasts first came around, just by luck, I'll say, because I don't consider myself overly hip or an early adopter of things, but I was an early adopter of podcasts as a listener.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
me too.
I loved the long form aspect to things. And I thought that in a way, that was a big part of what drew me in. It was the idea of long form interviews and being able to have that relatively intimate parasocial feeling of someone in your ear doing is storytelling or whatever it might be. So there's that, right? So I'm not overly interested in 10-second takes, I guess. Clearly we have a series of those when we do the show. It's kind of the nature of how we're going to construct this thing. And, we air some ideas out, but I would just rather, I think complex ideas need a little more space. And the same, I would say, goes for music. I can simultaneously acknowledge that the album as an art form has most likely hit its peak before I was born, frankly.
Yeah.
And has been in some kind of decline or static long tail situation since then. But I still like the idea of an artist purposely compiling songs and putting them in a certain order and it being a snapshot of where that artist is at or what they're trying to do. At the same time, I also have a shortened attention span. And I will fully admit that in my current life, my regular life, half an album, like one side of a record, when I'm having a dinner party is usually right about enough for me. And it is, in some ways, the show is designed to snap me out of that and get me to listen to things all the way through. And that can be a little bit challenging to fit into your life. And it was certainly something I was feeling a little disconnected from before we started the show, was discovering new music, was like putting new music in front of my ears consistently and actually living with it for an extended period of time. I have one more comment, and this is important to me, as to how we listen to music. One listen through is not enough. Guaranteed. We try to do, we do this, we have this hamster wheel of a show where we listen to one album for a week. And I don't know, maybe I'll get 10 listens of the album in a week. Or maybe I'll get, let's say, 2 strongly active listens and several background listens, some combination, right? Get it in there. To be honest, even that's not really enough. I get it. Things grow on you over time. So, but it was important to me that you give yourself a chance to like something. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the thing that I want to sum as an answer to your question is let your commentary, your podcasts, and your music, let it breathe and let your brain breathe it in. Even if you have to break it up into 15-minute chunks or whatever you need to do to get through it, live with it and judge it over a slightly longer period of time. I think that's how we were evolved to do it, and that's what I recommend.
If you zoom out 10, 15 years from now, I mean, you have a lot of albums to go. But I'm curious how, again, 10, 15 years from now, how do you hope people will look or talk about the influence of shows like yours on how we sort of understand, the music of the past? Do you have sort of a grander vision or mission for the show?
Yeah, I think I sort of hate this word I'm about to use, but I think our show could rightfully be called infotainment, which is to say we focus on storytelling and being good at storytelling, but we go out of our way to make it lighthearted and the opposite of dry, right? You get that through occasional jokes in our backstory and asides and little tangents, but mostly through the nature of the relationship and just having a little playful back and forth. But at its core, it is a story. It is the backstory of the band, hopefully told in an entertaining way and with a musician's level view of it, right? So I truly have no idea if anyone will care about our show in 10 or 20 years. However, it would be great to think that some of the pieces we've produced, if we think of them as almost journalistic pieces, can really be worth listening to in a decade or more. That we just covered, for instance, Siamese Dream, the Smashing Pumpkins album, which is an album that we all were around. We're the right age for that album. So it's a good example of something where we do have a lot of context. And I thought we did an excellent job with it. It's going to come out soon. Probably by the time this comes out, it'll be out. I'd love to believe that someone who cares about Smashing Pumpkins would listen to that in 10 or 20 years and get value. And I think that's well within the realm of possibility. So we are aiming for something that can last in terms of the story being told. But, how much can you predetermine that, frankly?
Sure. Yeah. You're now past episode 250 from what I can see.
Yeah.
What happens to the show when you get to the end of the list? Is there a world where 1001 Album Complaints outlives the book that it was sort of inspired by?
I gotta be honest with you. I'm gonna be blown away if we get to 1001 episodes. It's definitely within the realm of possibility, but it's a challenging show to produce. And I like it that way. Let me be clear. We designed it that way. It requires a lot of research. And we were able to share that work. That's one of our strategies. We share it between the co-hosts, but it can, if we're not careful, take over our lives. And so I guess that's my way of saying I'm not really worried about the end of that road. I'll also point out, which is still 15 years ahead of us, by the way, we do occasionally mix in what we call glaring omissions, right? Which often our audience helps us vote on and things like that, where we cover albums that we think were omitted unfairly. And there are plenty, by the way, that I think could at least be argued that they belong. So we can extend the show that way. And furthermore, you may or may not know, but this book, 1001 Album Complaints, this book, which is called 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die, has multiple editions.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So even though it was originally published in the 90s, they have revised it. So I think like the real number of albums that have ever been in it is approaching 1,100. And I believe a new edition is coming out this year.
You got your work cut out for you.
Indeed, we do. Indeed, we do. And by the way, it's one of these weird things where I have a paper copy of the book, but there's no single great online resource that actually tells you what is in the current edition of the book. Like, it doesn't seem like anyone's really keeping up with it. There are these different copies of it, and every once in a while stuff gets dropped, stuff gets added. We try our best to stay up with that, obviously, but I know that we've done episodes on albums that I believe in the latest edition of the book are no longer in the book, for instance.
What are 3 podcasts you'd recommend to anyone?
Yeah. I'm not sure about anyone, but I'll tell you things that I really like. I keep up with a show called Freakonomics. I quite like it. It is, let's call it an NPR style show, a storytelling show about, they tell stories about everyday life and different things from an economic kind of perspective, like the economics of the NFL. What is the NFL as a business? How does it work? How does it function? Things like that, but also societal stuff. And it is based on a series of books that I read and enjoyed years ago. I almost always listen to that. And, when I was planning 1001 Album Complaints, I wanted there to be a strong element of that NPR style produced storytelling to what we were doing. So that is a little on the drier side, but I always find it interesting. It always has interesting takes on it. Another storytelling show that's more recent, and perhaps this is overly Silicon Valley-esque, but I'm biased in that regard. It's called Acquired, where two friends tell the backstory to companies and talk about how they came about in a storytelling fashion, but also comment on them. It's relatively lighthearted, but with a ton of research, and then comment on how they make their money and sort of from an investment point of view, what you should think about them. They don't produce an episode every week. It almost reads like an audio book. Like, they're so in depth, but they've done some great episodes on companies like Costco and Trader Joe's, and always interesting stuff in there. Again, you can see I kind of like the story behind the thing. The last one I'll mention is more of a straight comedy podcast, because we're trying to, on our show, ride the line between comedy and storytelling. So the last one I'll mention is Bad Friends, which is two stand-up comedians, Bobby Lee and Andrew Santino, do a podcast once a week. They have a friendship. It is a contentious friendship, but it's a real friendship. And I think, in my mind, they're better than almost any other two comedians with two microphones, because I can feel them pedaling the bike while they're doing the show, in terms of the improv games they're playing with each other and keeping it interesting and keeping it fun, but also that beneath it, there is this complicated personal relationship. That is what's really driving it for me. That's important component of where the comedy is coming from. So those are my three: Bad Friends, Freakonomics, and Acquired.
And where can people find you online?
Oh man, I'm everywhere. Well, 1001albumcomplaints.com has all the links. We're on Instagram. We're, of course, on YouTube. And we also run a record label where we put out our own records and our friends' records called The Chop Unlimited. And, of course, if you want to listen to the show, I recommend listening to it on Spotify, but really any podcast player. You can find it. You can listen. You can enjoy.
Rob, it's been awesome speaking with you today. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Talk That Pod. Make sure to follow us on all the social places. Just search for Talk That Pod. And if you're not subscribed yet, this podcast is also available on YouTube at Talk That Pod Show. Also, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it. And if you really liked it, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you're a podcaster who wants to come on the show, go to talkthatpod.net and submit a request. Finding great podcasts is hard. That's why you should also check out Find That Pod. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter I write every week, bringing you 5 amazing new podcasts you should listen to. Subscribe today at findthatpod.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.